I want to start this by saying I didn't grow up abused in the way people imagine when they hear words like toxic family. There were no bruises, no screaming matches, no dramatic scenes that would have made it obvious something was wrong. Instead, there was something quieter and far more damaging. A lifetime of being tolerated instead of loved, included but never chosen, present but never truly seen. From the outside, my family looked normal, comfortable home, regular holidays, family photos framed on the walls. But from the inside, I always felt like I was standing slightly outside the circle, close enough to see the warmth, but never close enough to feel it. Every dinner conversation seemed to move around me instead of through me. Every celebration felt like something I was allowed to attend rather than something meant for me. My mother never said she didn't love me. She didn't have to. It was in the way she corrected me more than my sister, in the way she praised others, but stayed silent about me, in the way she spoke about family, while somehow making me feel like I was only a guest. My father was quieter, not cruel, just absent in the moments that mattered most, the kind of absence that teaches you not to expect protection. Growing up, I learned early how to read the room, how to stay small, how not to ask for too much because asking meant disappointment, and disappointment felt worse when you already suspected you were asking for something you weren't entitled to. I told myself this was just how families were, that love was subtle, that maybe I was too sensitive, maybe I needed to earn it. My sister never had to earn anything. She existed and was celebrated for it. Her mistakes were brushed off, her achievements amplified. I watched this difference quietly, never naming it out loud because naming it would mean admitting the truth, that I wasn't equal. And once you admit that, you can't unsee it. The only person who ever made me feel like I truly belonged was my grandmother. She didn't treat me like a project or a responsibility. She treated me like a person. She listened when I spoke, remembered the things I cared about, defended me in subtle ways that my younger self didn't fully understand at the time. When I sat next to her, I felt safe, like I didn't have to perform to deserve space. When she died, something in me went quiet, not dramatic grief, just a deep, settling sadness, like the last light in a familiar room had been switched off. The funeral came and went, the family gathered, people cried, hugged, said the right words, and then life moved on, as if nothing fundamental had changed, except for me, because I felt more alone than I ever had. After the funeral, the house felt colder, conversations shorter, patience thinner. I told myself it was just grief affecting everyone, but in truth, the balance had shifted. Whatever quiet protection my grandmother had provided was gone, and I felt it immediately. Then months passed, and I tried to settle back into my routine, work, responsibilities, staying out of the way, telling myself this was adulthood, that not feeling seen was normal, that I was expecting too much. And that was when the phone call came, a call that shouldn't have come, from a man who introduced himself as my grandmother's attorney. He said my name carefully, as if it mattered, and asked if we could meet privately. He said there were documents my grandmother had left specifically for me, and that no one else in my family was to know about it yet. When I asked why, he paused, then said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. He said my grandmother was very clear that I might need time to prepare. I didn't know what I needed to prepare for, but for the first time in my life, someone was treating me like I was at the center of something important, not an afterthought, not a side note. And as I sat there holding my phone after the call ended, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope, because hope is dangerous when you've spent your life learning not to trust it. What I didn't know then was that this call was the beginning of everything coming apart, and everything finally making sense. I didn't tell anyone about the call at first. Not my parents, not my sister, not even friends, because some instincts don't need logic. They just tell you when silence is safer. And something about the way the attorney spoke made it clear this wasn't meant to be shared casually over dinner. The next morning, I sat in his office, surrounded by shelves of old legal books and the faint smell of polished wood, the kind of place where history feels heavy. He didn't waste time with small talk. He placed a thick envelope on the desk between us and said my grandmother had prepared everything years ago while she was still sharp and healthy, and that she'd been very specific about the timing. He said the will had already been settled publicly, but this was separate, private, intentional, and before I could ask what that meant, he looked me straight in the eye and said something that made my chest tighten. He said, "Your grandmother anticipated conflict, and she wanted you protected before it began." I opened the envelope slowly, my hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. Inside were documents, letters, and a smaller sealed packet with my name written in her handwriting. The attorney told me not to open that one yet, only when absolutely necessary. His voice dropped slightly when he said those words, like he knew exactly how heavy they were. I skimmed the letter first. My grandmother's words felt like a voice from another room, calm, loving, apologetic. She wrote about things she wished she'd said while she was alive, about regrets, about watching things she didn't stop soon enough. And then she wrote something that made me stop breathing for a moment. She wrote that I belonged in ways I had never been told, and that one day the truth would matter. I looked up at the attorney, confused, overwhelmed, and asked him why she would wait, why she wouldn't just say this openly, and he sighed. The kind of sigh people make when they've carried someone else's burden too long. He said, "Sometimes telling the truth too early only gives the wrong people time to destroy it." I left that office with my mind spinning, the envelope heavier than paper should be. Every step back to my car felt unreal, like I'd stepped into a story I didn't recognize yet. I wanted to go straight home and read everything again, but life doesn't pause just because your world is shifting. That same evening, a message appeared in the family group chat. My mother announced they were throwing me a birthday dinner, not a quiet one, not a casual thing, but a large gathering at an expensive restaurant, extended family, friends, people I barely knew, the kind of event they'd never bothered to plan for me before. I stared at the message longer than I should have. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was suspicion, because when something changes suddenly in a family that thrives on patterns, it's rarely kindness. It's usually strategy. Still, a part of me wanted to believe, wanted to think maybe this was my chance. Maybe the distance I'd always felt was closing. Maybe this was their way of acknowledging me, healing something that had always been broken. I didn't respond right away. I set my phone down and thought about my grandmother's letter, about preparation, about protection. And for the first time I wondered if those words were meant for this moment. When I finally replied, I kept it polite, grateful, non-committal, because that's what I'd learned to do, keep emotions measured, expectations low, and reactions controlled. But deep down, something felt off, like standing on ice that hasn't cracked yet, but already sounds hollow. Over the next few days, little things began to stand out. My mother's sudden sweetness, my sister's curiosity that felt more like inspection, my father's quiet avoidance whenever the topic came up. No one asked how I felt, no one asked if I wanted this. It was all being done around me, not with me. Late one night, I took the envelope out again and placed it on my bed. The sealed packet stared back at me like a promise and a warning at the same time. I didn't open it, not yet, but I understood something clearly for the first time. Whatever was coming, I needed to be ready, because this wasn't just a birthday dinner. It was a stage, and someone in my family was planning a performance. The week leading up to the dinner felt wrong, in ways I couldn't fully explain, like living in a house where all the furniture has been moved just slightly. Nothing obvious, but enough to make your instincts stay alert. My mother kept calling, checking details she'd never cared about before, what I'd wear, when I'd arrive, who I was bringing. She sounded cheerful but rehearsed, like she was reading lines rather than speaking naturally. My sister started texting more than usual too, asking casual questions that didn't feel casual at all, whether I was still working late, whether I'd been talking to anyone lately, whether I'd heard anything new about Grandma's estate. That last one made my stomach tighten. My father stayed mostly silent, which was normal for him, but this silence felt heavier, like avoidance instead of indifference. Whenever I mentioned the dinner, he'd nod and change the subject, eyes fixed on something else, anywhere but me. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the sealed envelope again, debating whether to open it. Curiosity battled fear, because once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. And something told me this truth would burn bridges no matter how carefully I handled it. In the end, I didn't open it. Not because I wasn't ready, but because I wanted to see what my family would do first. I wanted to know who they were when they thought I was unarmed. The restaurant was exactly what you'd expect. Elegant, loud in that polite way expensive places are, full of people who smile with their mouths and judge with their eyes. I arrived early and immediately felt out of place, like I always had at family events. My mother greeted me with a hug that lasted a second too long, and felt a second too tight. She kept one hand on my arm as if anchoring me, guiding me toward the center of the room, like I was a prop that needed to be positioned correctly. My sister barely acknowledged me at first. She was too busy talking to guests, laughing loudly, making sure everyone knew she belonged there. When she finally looked at me, her smile was sharp, assessing, not warm. People kept congratulating me, saying things like, "You deserve this," or "Your family must be so proud." Each comment landed strangely. Because none of them matched the reality I'd lived, they were reacting to a story that had never included me. Dinner started normally enough. Food arrived, glasses clinked, polite conversation filled the air, and for a brief moment I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this was just awkward love expressed badly. Maybe I was projecting old wounds onto a new situation. Then my mother stood up. She tapped her glass lightly, smiled, and the room quieted. She looked around proudly, soaking in the attention, then turned toward me with a look I didn't recognize. Not affection, not anger, something closer to satisfaction. She started talking about family, about sacrifice, about how hard it is to raise a child who isn't really yours. The words hit slowly at first, like rain before a storm. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others leaned in. My heart started pounding because suddenly I understood this wasn't a celebration, it was an announcement. She talked about generosity, about taking someone in, about how grateful that person should be. Every sentence narrowed until there was nowhere left to hide. Then she said it plainly. She said I wasn't really theirs, that I was adopted, that they'd taken me in out of kindness. The room went silent. I felt every pair of eyes turned toward me, some shocked, some curious, some almost entertained. My sister laughed, not loudly, just enough to break the tension. My father stared at his plate like it held the answer to everything. My mother kept talking, explaining herself like this was a reasonable thing to do, like she was clearing up a misunderstanding rather than detonating my life in front of dozens of people. I didn't hear all of it. The words blurred together because something inside me went very still, the kind of stillness that happens right before something breaks or hardens forever. She finished by saying honesty matters, that secrets poison families, and that I deserved the truth, her truth. That's when I felt the envelope in my jacket pocket. And for the first time that night I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because I finally understood this wasn't an ambush. It was a miscalculation. The silence after my mother finished speaking felt heavier than any insult she'd ever thrown at me. 40 people sat frozen, waiting to see what I would do next, waiting for the reaction they'd clearly been promised. My sister tilted her phone slightly, making sure the camera still had a clear view of my face. She was smiling like someone watching a performance they'd already rehearsed in their head. My father still hadn't looked up. I stood there slowly, deliberately, letting the moment stretch, because for the first time in my life I wasn't rushing to make anyone comfortable. I wasn't apologizing for existing. I thanked my mother calmly. That single word, thank you, landed wrong in the room. Confusion flickered across her face. This wasn't the reaction she'd planned for. I'd told her she was right about one thing, that honesty does matter and that secrets do poison families. Then I said it was only fair that if truths were being shared, all of them should be. That's when I reached into my jacket. You could feel the room tense instantly, like everyone leaned forward at the same time. My sister stopped smiling. My mother's hand tightened around her glass. I pulled out the envelope. Not dramatically, not fast, just enough for people to see it clearly. The wax seal, the aged paper, the initials on the corner. I said it came from my grandmother, and that she'd asked me to keep it private until the moment it became necessary. My mother interrupted me, her voice sharp, telling me this wasn't the time or place, but she'd already decided that when she stood up with a microphone. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a copy of the will. I read the first line out loud, not raising my voice, just letting the words do the work. My grandmother had left the estate to me, the house, the land, everything attached to it. The reaction wasn't immediate. People needed a second to process it. Whispers began spreading. Heads turned toward my mother, toward my sister. Someone actually laughed in disbelief. My sister stepped forward, accusing me of lying, of manipulating the situation, of trying to steal something that didn't belong to me. Her voice was shaking now, anger layered over panic. That's when the attorney stood up. I hadn't even noticed him sitting there until that moment. He introduced himself calmly and confirmed the document's authenticity, explained that the will had been prepared years earlier, legally witnessed, and was set to become public soon. My mother's face drained of color. For the first time that night she looked afraid, not embarrassed, not angry, afraid. She tried to argue, saying the house was meant for the family, that she'd maintained it, lived in it, hosted holidays there. The attorney responded gently but firmly that maintenance does not equal ownership. The room felt like it was tilting. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, not from fear, but from clarity. Years of confusion were snapping into place. Moments I'd dismissed suddenly made sense. The way my grandmother treated me differently, the quiet protection, the warnings I never understood. I told them there was more. I pulled out the letter my grandmother had written to me, her handwriting steady, deliberate, loving. I read the parts where she talked about truth, about courage, about how sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones desperate to hide something. My father finally looked up then. His eyes were wet. He didn't say anything, but the guilt was unmistakable, the kind that comes from knowing you let something terrible happen because it was easier than stopping it. My sister tried to interrupt again, her voice cracking as she demanded to know what else I thought I had. That's when I told her about the second envelope, the one I hadn't opened until that morning. I told them it contained proof, not opinions, not memories. Proof. The room went completely silent. My mother sat down slowly, like her legs had finally given out, and in that moment I realized something important. This wasn't about inheritance or property. It was about control. And for the first time in my life, they no longer had it. I didn't open the second envelope right away. I held it in my hands for a moment longer than necessary, because I understood something then that I hadn't before. Once the truth came out, there would be no way to put it back. My mother was staring at the envelope like it was a weapon. My sister had stopped pretending altogether. The phone in her hand lowered slowly as reality began catching up to her performance. I told them this envelope wasn't meant to hurt anyone. It was meant to protect me. Those were my grandmother's exact words, and she had been very clear that it should only be opened if I was being destroyed publicly. I broke the seal. Inside were documents. Old but meticulously preserved, birth records, legal affidavits, letters exchanged between lawyers decades ago. I could feel my hands shaking, but my voice stayed steady as I explained what they meant. I wasn't adopted for tax benefits. I wasn't taken in out of charity. I was family, not by marriage, not by convenience, but by blood. My grandmother had known it the entire time. My father stood up abruptly then, knocking his chair back. His face had gone pale in a way I'd never seen before. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His silence told the room everything before I ever finished explaining. The documents showed that my biological father was her son, the one no one talked about, the one erased from family conversations, the one who'd been labeled a problem and quietly removed from the story. When he died, I was a child, and instead of acknowledging me openly, the family decided it would be easier to rewrite the truth, to fold me into the household under a lie, to raise me while reminding me constantly that I should be grateful for it. My mother stood up shaking, calling it absurd, accusing my grandmother of manipulation, even in death. But the attorney calmly confirmed every page, every signature, every date. There was no arguing it. My sister's face twisted into something between disbelief and rage. She screamed that it wasn't fair, that she'd lived her whole life believing this family was hers, that I was taking everything. That's when I realized she still didn't understand. This was never about taking something from her. It was about finally being given the truth. I told her I hadn't come to take revenge, that I hadn't planned to expose anyone, but when you humiliate someone publicly, you lose the right to control how the truth responds. My father finally spoke then, his voice barely audible. He admitted he'd known, that he'd agreed to the lie because confronting it would have torn the family apart. He said he thought raising me quietly was better than abandoning me completely. I looked at him and said quietly that being present without protection is another form of absence. The room felt fractured. Alliances dissolved in real time. People shifted away from my mother instinctively. Whispers spread. Eyes avoided hers. The mask she'd worn for decades had slipped completely. I told them the will would become public soon, that the estate transfer was legal and final, but that wasn't the end of the story. Because the truth my grandmother left me wasn't just about ownership. It was about choice. I told them I wouldn't make any decisions that night, not about the house, not about relationships, not about forgiveness, because the first thing I needed was space to exist without being rewritten. As I sat down, something strange happened. No one spoke. No one clapped. No one argued. For the first time in my life, the family that had controlled the narrative around me had nothing left to say. And I realized something else in that silence. I wasn't standing there trying to belong anymore. I already did. When the guests finally started leaving, it didn't happen all at once. It happened in fragments, people whispering goodbyes, coats being pulled on too slowly, eyes avoiding my mother's face as if proximity itself had become uncomfortable. Some of them squeezed my shoulder on the way out, others nodded with a look that said they didn't know what to say, but knew they'd just witnessed something that couldn't be undone. My sister disappeared first, slipping out with her phone clutched tight. The recording she'd planned to weaponize, now useless, maybe even dangerous to her if it ever surfaced. My mother stayed seated long after most of the room had emptied, her posture rigid, her expression frozen somewhere between rage and disbelief, like she was still waiting for someone to tell her this was a misunderstanding. My father approached me cautiously, not as a parent, but as someone who knew he'd lost the authority he'd relied on for years. He said my name softly, like he used to when I was a kid, and he needed me to stay calm. I told him this wasn't a conversation we were having tonight, not because I didn't want answers, but because I didn't trust myself not to accept excuses dressed up as regret. He nodded, eyes glassy, and for the first time I saw him as a man who had chosen comfort over courage and paid for it in silence. My mother finally stood, smoothing her dress like she could still salvage dignity through appearance alone. She said this wasn't over, that families survive worse than this, that airing secrets only causes damage. I looked at her and said quietly that secrets don't damage families, the way people use them does. She flinched at that, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I'd left before she could say anything else. Outside, the night air felt sharper than it had earlier, like the world had shifted temperature without warning. I stood there for a moment just breathing, realizing how exhausting it had been to hold myself together inside that room. My phone buzzed non-stop on the drive home. Messages from relatives, from people I hadn't heard from in years, some apologizing, some asking questions, some suddenly remembering moments they'd overlooked. I didn't respond. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the documents spread out on the table, the will, the letters, the proof that my life hadn't been an accident or a favor. I thought about my grandmother, about how carefully she'd planned this, how she'd known exactly what kind of storm would follow the truth. And I understood why she hadn't told me sooner. She hadn't been protecting herself. She'd been protecting me. The next morning, my sister called. I let it go to voicemail. Then she texted, long paragraphs alternating between anger and fear, accusing me of stealing something that was hers, then asking what would happen to her now. I stared at the screen and realized something important. This was the first time she was afraid of losing something she'd always assumed belonged to her. I didn't reply. Later that day, my father showed up at my door unannounced, standing there with his hands in his pockets like a man waiting for judgment. He said he wasn't there to defend anyone, that he just wanted to tell me the truth from his side, the parts he'd buried. He told me about the brother they'd erased, about the pressure to keep appearances intact, about how lying once had turned into lying forever. He said he thought he was doing the least harmful thing. I told him the least harmful thing would have been telling the truth and letting the family deal with discomfort instead of turning one person into a lifelong sacrifice. He didn't argue. He asked what I wanted now. And for the first time in my life, I answered honestly. I said, I wanted time, distance, and boundaries that wouldn't be negotiated. I told him if there was any chance of rebuilding something, it would happen slowly and without expectations. He agreed, not eagerly, not defensively, but like someone who finally understood the cost of delay. After he left, I felt something loosen inside me, not forgiveness, not peace, but clarity. I wasn't responsible for fixing what I hadn't broken. And the truth, once spoken, didn't belong to anyone else anymore. The will became public exactly 2 weeks later, and when it did, it landed like a quiet earthquake. There was no dramatic announcement, no confrontation, just legal notices and reality settling in where denial used to live. The house was officially mine, not as a reward, not as revenge, but as a correction, something that had always been meant to happen finally happening. My mother tried to contest it, not loudly, not publicly, but through lawyers and carefully worded claims about influence and intent. Every argument fell apart under documentation my grandmother had prepared years in advance. When the challenge failed, she stopped calling. My sister didn't. She oscillated between anger and desperation, one day accusing me of tearing the family apart, the next asking if we could talk like siblings again. I told her the truth wasn't what broke us, it was what revealed what had already been broken for decades. That conversation ended without resolution, and I stopped waiting for one. I visited the house alone for the first time on a grey afternoon, the kind of day where the sky feels low and everything sounds quieter than usual. The rooms still smelled faintly of old furniture and polished wood, memories clinging to the walls like dust. I walked through each room slowly, not reliving the pain, but acknowledging it, understanding that this place had held both neglect and love, sometimes at the same time. In my grandmother's room, I found a small box tucked behind a stack of books. Inside were photographs I'd never seen, letters she'd written but never sent, and one final note addressed to me in her careful handwriting. She wrote that families often choose convenience over truth, and that the ones who suffer are usually the ones who care the most. She told me I didn't owe anyone silence, obedience, or gratitude for surviving mistreatment. She told me that belonging isn't something you beg for, it's something you claim. I sat on the edge of her bed and cried, not from sadness, but from the release of finally being seen by someone who had understood everything. In the months that followed, I made decisions slowly and deliberately. I didn't rush to renovate the house or fill it with people. I let it be quiet, let it become neutral ground instead of a battleground. I set boundaries that were clear and final. No surprise visits, no private conversations twisted into leverage, no rewriting of history to make anyone feel more comfortable. My father respected those boundaries, awkwardly at first, then consistently. Our relationship didn't heal overnight, but it stopped bleeding. As for my mother, I stopped trying to understand her motivations. Some people don't want reconciliation, they want control back. And I wasn't offering that anymore. The biggest change wasn't external, it was internal. I stopped explaining myself, stopped justifying choices that were healthy simply because they upset people who benefited from my silence. I learned that peace doesn't come from fixing everything. It comes from refusing to keep breaking yourself, to keep others comfortable. Years from now, people might tell this story differently. They might say the family fell apart because of inheritance, because of pride, because of ego. But I know the truth. The family fell apart because it was built on lies, and when the truth finally stood up in a room full of witnesses, it didn't destroy anything real. It only destroyed the illusion. And what was left afterward was something I'd never had before. A life that belonged to me. If you've ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of family, if you've ever been made to feel like the price of belonging was your dignity, remember this. You don't owe loyalty to people who only love you when you're small. And sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it gives you your life back. Be honest with yourself before you answer this. If someone humiliated you publicly, erased your worth for years, and expected silence in return, would you still protect their reputation? Or would you finally protect yourself? Drop your answer, because I know people are going to disagree on this one.